and that is that over lunch, we are having, if you look at your agenda, we're having sort of self-organized discussions. So there were a number of issues that we didn't have time to put into the full agenda, or issues that people brought to us that they wanted to see discussed. And one small way that we're addressing that is that if you want to have a specific discussion with a group of people over lunch, you can do it. So far we have 3 that are organized. There's an election protection discussion, there's a discussion of state reform ballot measures, and a discussion of PACs and their role in running for office. So the papers are over there on the wall, over on to my left. If you want to create one, not much time, but you can do it, or you're welcome to attend one of those, or just enjoy yourself for lunch. Okay, I think we're going to have a really interesting panel. I will let Gara LaMarche introduce the panelists, although I know them, and I'm delighted that they're here. But I wanted to introduce Gara. A couple of things. I've known Gara LaMarche for probably 20 years. Have really considered him a friend and a true movement leader. I wanted to say his bio with 2 things. I think in my mind, he's had 2 major roles in the movement wherever he goes. One is to be a serious and large, at-scale and unafraid investor in creating campaigns for justice and a movement. And secondly, I've begun to call him the challenger-in-chief for the movement, wherever he goes. He started his career, this was before I knew him, at the ACLU in Texas, where he took on many, many important issues. But then he went to the Open Society Foundation as the director of U.S. programs, and really helped to create there, added to the civil liberties focus that they had, a real focus on democracy and building a democracy that really works, changing the rules, helping the people to organize for power. And I think that was a really important role. Then he went to Atlantic Philanthropies, and at that point, some of you may know this, but Atlantic put in a gigantic set of grants into the field of winning health care. Probably the largest advocacy grant that I know of ever into Health Care for America Now, and I think that was pivotal in the victory of health care, which, as I've heard during the course of this campaign, is not quite finished. Yeah. Anyway, and now he's the president of the Democracy Alliance, has helped to organize progressive donors to both support movement activity, but also to clarify and think through their roles, and has helped the Democracy Alliance to focus on the inequality issues, both economic and racial, and on democracy as well as on the environment. And when I say challenger-in-chief, this will lead to the panel. When he was in philanthropy, both at Open Society and at Atlantic, he was consistently writing, challenging the philanthropic community overall to be more advocacy-oriented, to do more general support, to not be as metrics fanatically focused, but to really make sure that they were investing in the big possibilities for change. He's been challenging the donors in the Democracy Alliance to get more strategic and to make sure that they're honing their investments in the best direction. And he has begun recently to challenge the democracy movement, the progressive movement, on the issue of race, and understanding that the issue of race, issues of racism, are central to changing our democracy. So he, in my mind, as we started to talk about at this conference, really building a reflective democracy, which means 2 things. One, it means how do we fix our democracy as a whole, to be more reflective of the people in it, but also how do we create a democracy movement that is genuinely and truly reflective of all the people who care about making our democracy work. He's now like a very reasonable person to introduce and to moderate this panel, so it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the Democracy Alliance, my friend Gara LaMarche. Gara?
Thank you, Miles. Thanks, Miles. This works, right? It's always hard to tell when you're up here. Okay. That was a lovely but much too fulsome introduction. The only correction I want to make in it is that to be called an investor is not quite right. I've never actually invested my own money in anything. I have had the good fortune to be hired by rich people to redistribute their wealth. So I consider myself more of a professional redistributionist than an investor. And I want to return the compliment to Miles. I have known Miles for 20 years. Miles, I know Miles's values and Miles' record, and I've watched in the last year or two the leadership that he's shown after having built Demos into a terrific institution and set the table for strong leaders of color to take the leadership there. I've seen what he's been doing at Common Cause, which is a really hugely significant, well-branded, effective kind of legacy organization founded by John Gardner almost 50 years ago. And I've seen the way Miles has brought energy and also a connection to social movements to an organization that's really an iconic organization in American life. And I can see that in the program today and in the room. So I really salute Miles for his leadership at Common Cause. So we're here today to talk about reflective democracy, and that is a term of art that is, in my experience, having dealt with these things over a number of years, relatively new, to me anyway. I first became aware of it when the Women Donors Network, and there may be people here who are active in the Women Donors Network, started a reflective democracy project. And when I first became aware of it, I must say that I thought that it meant, contemplative or I had images of, silent meditation or whatever. But as I've come to kind of understand the term, I think it is actually a really useful addition to the way we talk about these things, because what it means is whether the democracy reflects the citizenship or the people in the country. And I think it's really, it's a good term, and I've started to use it a little bit myself, and I noticed it kind of worked its way into the title of this program. So, we want to be reflective about whether the democracy is reflective. We want to talk in the next hour or so among ourselves and with you about how we build a movement for democracy that is inclusive, reflective, and responsive to the needs of the people. We're living in a time where, on the one hand, in the Democratic Party, we see a much greater willingness to address the questions of structural racism and to be responsive to the movements that we just heard in the last panel about Flint and both Flint and Ferguson and all the events in between and around them that have given rise to movement for Black Lives and related movements, the Dreamers and so on. Those are all, in my view, centered on the failure of democracy. Whatever, whether it's the water crisis in Flint or the killing of young people of color in cities all across this country, those are, when you look deeper, are failures of democracy. So the democracy movement has no choice and cannot possibly be effective unless it deals with that and understands those to be central issues of democracy. So we see in the Democratic Party, as a result of social movements, a much greater imperative of addressing and talking about these issues. We see in the Republican side, I'll say in this nonpartisan space, a responsiveness, if you will, to a different kind of social movement. Tea Party, white supremacists, and the discourse increasingly shaped in that way. So on the one hand, you have, a much greater willingness to engage because of social movements with issues of structural racism among progressives, and that I view as extremely encouraging sign of the impact of social movements. On the other side, you have a trend that began with the election of, didn't begin with the election of Obama, but the election of President Obama crystallized, that is heightened ever since, which is, the movement away from dog whistle politics, to fire alarm politics. And it's those kinds of issues that we want to touch on today. So we want to talk about what's different about our conversations about race and inclusiveness today, and how do leaders, and the three of them to my right on this panel, help shape those issues and address the needs of people who need real reform and real action. I think that my participation on this panel probably grows out of not only some of the history that Miles mentioned, but just to get it started for myself, in trying to challenge both myself and colleagues. You know, I spoke a couple of months ago to a funders group, the Funders Committee for Citizen Participation, and this ended up being adapted into an article a couple of weeks ago in The Nation about race and democracy. And what I was trying to say, or challenge myself and others to think about, is that the notion of what civic engagement is, what a democracy movement is, has to take account, on the one hand, of the resurgence of direct action around the country. And to see that, not as something off to the side, but as a key form of civic engagement that can have as great an impact, actually, on policy and on discourse as more traditional forms of civic engagement like voting. So if you look at the impact of the movement for Black Lives, you look at the way the discourse was changed by Occupy Wall Street and a host of reforms that have come in its wake, if you look at the impact of the Dreamers on policy, what you see is, in a long tradition of direct action and social protest, you see a real impact. And we have to have a conception, those of us who fund and work in what we call democracy, that democracy as a toolkit that has a number of things in it. And while it is almost never comfortable or even appropriate for funders to be, funding direct action, it's just not in the nature of the beast, you can't really have a coherent democracy strategy without taking account of it. And the other thing that I was trying to work out for myself and convey is that, the presenting issue in Ferguson, in Baltimore, and a number of other places has been Black lives and the mass incarceration and police practices and the interaction between communities of color and the police. And those have been moved to the top or toward the top of the national agenda by those movements. I think there's a tendency for those of us like me who have worked in both democracy as traditionally conceived and criminal justice, because both of the foundations that I had the privilege of leading were for 20 years significant investors in social movements to end mass incarceration and deal with police practices. There's been a tendency, I think, even for those of us deeply involved in both of those movements, to see them as separate spheres, to see democracy over here and justice reform over here. And the argument that I would make is that they are really the same sphere. And I think that, among other things, is what the movement for Black Lives challenges us to understand. And that if you are about building progressive infrastructure, if you are about building a stronger democracy, you must have a kind of a unified theory of the case that takes all these things into account. That's my latest crusade as an argument to fellow funders, as an argument to my colleagues in the Democracy Alliance, and it may have something to do with why Common Cause asked me to lead this panel today. So what we're going to do is the three people to my right, Sayu Bhojwani, Fred Azcarate, and Adriana Alvarez, happen to be alphabetically at the top of your biographical sheets. It's very, very convenient, so you don't have to turn the page or anything, to learn a lot more about them. And you've already learned more than you need to know about me from Miles. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask our panelists to take a couple of minutes in the next period of this panel to both talk about themselves and start out by talking about themselves and why they're in this movement and why they're in this space. So I'm not going to do any further introduction to them except to say that Sayu is the head of the New American Leaders Project, and she's going to talk about research on both the mechanics and the motivations of engaging leaders in communities of color to run, to serve in office, and engage the electorate. He's going to look at some of the strategies involved in serving in public life, both the financial costs and the psychological aspects. So we're going to talk about reflective democracy in politics and in government. Fred Azcarate, who's the relatively new, but you don't know how long you get to say that. I like to consider myself the relatively new president of the Democracy Alliance because I'm held less accountable for anything I do wrong. But there comes a point where you don't get to be that anymore. So I don't know where you are on that spectrum, but relatively new president of U.S. Action is going to talk about building long-term political power at the local level, and will offer some state examples and lessons from their organizational merger of late and of developing a model organization that instills the democracy principles we fight for. So that is going to be at the organizational level and the movement level of reflective democracy. And Adriana Alvarez is with the Fight for 15, one of the most vibrant social movements and effective social movements of our time. Going to share her personal story of being a worker leader in her store and in the national movement, and what it's been like to move up the leadership pipeline for herself and some of the challenges she sees for other leaders moving up. So that's the frame of this. We'll talk among ourselves for a little while, and then we will open it up to this rich room, this rich in experience and perspective room, and maybe in other ways. And so I'll start with Sayu.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in. I actually just came back from Arizona on Sunday morning, where our organization was having, I think it's 4th or 5th training to prepare first and second generation Americans to run for office. How's that? Is that better? Okay. So I was saying that I just came back from Arizona, where we were doing our 4th or I think 5th training for first and second generation Americans to run for office. And what was different about this particular training is that we had brought folks from Orange County and Michigan and New York to join immigrant leaders in Arizona as we prepared them to run. And I want to share with you a couple of stories. One of the people in the training is Rick Montoya, who's a former Marine who was born and raised in Garden Grove. And when he came back from the Marines, he started to explore ways to get involved in political life and went to city council hearings and the like, and didn't see anyone from his part of Garden Grove, East Garden Grove, represented. And so he became a plaintiff in a lawsuit to move Garden Grove from at-large elections to district-based elections. And this year he's going to run for Garden Grove City Council in one of the newly drawn districts, so that East Garden Grove can finally have a middle-class Latino who was born and raised in the district represented on the council. Also in our training was a young woman named Athena Salman, who actually is running for Arizona State House. She's a half Palestinian and half Latina, who was a 6th grader during the September 11th attacks. And her best friend, I don't know if you all remember, but shortly after the attacks, a couple days after the attack, a Sikh man was shot in Mesa, Arizona, and he happened to be the uncle of her best friend. So that was her kind of launch into dealing with racism and xenophobia in the U.S. She and her family, she was a 6th grader again at the time, were placed on the government watch list, and she was only taken off that list a couple years ago when she was in her 20s. So every time she goes to an airport, every time she went to an airport, there was a red flag on her name. And we have 400 stories like that, maybe not all with such compelling details, but many, many like that. And I start with those stories because I think that in introducing myself, it's important to acknowledge what I have in common with the people that we train, starting with the fact that we have often felt like outsiders. Outsiders sometimes in our families, and maybe many of you in this room, just by the mere fact that you're spending 2 days talking about democracy, have felt like outsiders. But I mean specifically as visible minorities in our workplace, in our schools, and certainly in conversations about progressive issues and about democracy. In addition to being outsiders, there's been this sort of thread in my own life, and particularly in the first, I guess in the 2/3 of my life, lacking political and social capital. So it took me 17 years from the day that I first moved to the US as an international student to the day that I became a citizen. And that's without any major bumps. It's just how long the process takes. And then shortly thereafter, I was able to vote. I was in my 30s when I cast a vote for the first time. And then I joined the Bloomberg administration as Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, which was really a fluke. I mean, it was a fluke. I didn't know anyone in the administration. I hadn't worked on the campaign. It was a result of work that I had done in the community and the recognition that the administration had of that work. But I say fluke in that I had not been involved in political life up until that point. And so, I give you that story and share that story with you because both being an outsider and lacking political and social capital, but also caring about my community are some of the things that led me to start this organization. And so last week when I met with a funder and I explained our program model, which I will talk about in a few minutes, he said, well, what kind of research did you do to determine this program model? And I said, well, honestly, we have research now that came out of the many applications that our participants have filled out, but the research leading to the organization was the research of my own life, being an outsider, lacking political and social capital, and wanting to do something for my community. And so all of these things inform, the core work of our organization, which is to train first and second generation Americans to run for public office by teaching them the mechanics of political campaigns, but also providing the motivation. In a report that we released last month, well, I guess January, 2 months ago, we surveyed state legislators. And among the Asian American and Latino legislators, 50% of Asian Americans and 34% of Latinos said that they had never thought of running until someone asked them to consider running. And these are people who are in office. So they've overcome that barrier in order to run, and obviously there are many others. I probably don't need to emphasize to this group that among the Asian Americans and Latinos who said that they had never thought about running, the rates of women within those two groups are even higher. So 73% of Asian American women and 40% of Latinas said that they have never considered running for office. So a big part of the work that we do is teach the basic mechanics of running for campaigns, but do it within a values-based framework that asserts that the immigrant experience is an asset to the political process. So when we talk about story and messaging, we're talking about how important the immigrant story is to the American narrative. When we talk about targeting and reaching voters, we talk about prime voters, but also about low propensity voters, voters like myself who didn't make the prime voter list until well into my 30s because of the story that I described. Obviously, if you go to the prime voter list, the first time I voted, I wouldn't have been on that list. So talking about how do we expand the electorate by reaching into our communities and reaching out to those voters that are not on the radar of traditional candidates, and then talking about how to engage immigrant communities as low-dollar donors, as stakeholders in our democracy in a way that no one else has ever asked them to be. And in teaching these mechanics and in providing this motivation, what we hope for in the cases and what we have been able to achieve in cases like Rick's and Athena's and many others is a moment of awareness that they too can run for office, that they too can, despite their name, despite their ethnicity, despite their religion, despite the perception that immigrants are takers and not makers, can actually run for office. I will say that it's important, I think, for me to acknowledge why that matters. So it's not just about getting folks who look like me on the ballot and in decision-making positions, but it's also because we have people who are going to be representing the needs and interests of this diverse country that we're now living in, right? So if you think about someone like Carlos Menchaca, who's not an alum, but who's affiliated with our organization, the first Mexican-American elected to the New York City Council, he's not necessarily representing a predominantly Mexican-American community, but as a member of the Latino community and as the representative of a district in Brooklyn that has a large number of undocumented immigrants, he was a champion of a municipal ID that is now, used to access cultural institutions, to open bank accounts, and a whole range of things, not just for those undocumented immigrants, but for all New Yorkers.
I have one in my pocket.
You have one in your pocket, and which, by the way, I went to an event at the White House in November with Carlos, and I pulled out my global entry card as an ID, and they didn't recognize it, but they recognized the Muni ID. And it's an idea that's catching on. I talked to Michelle Wu in Boston yesterday. She's a city council member, the president of the city council actually, and they're bringing Muni ID to Boston. They're taking it to Phoenix, and it has implications not just for undocumented immigrants, but for creating a kind of sameness and unity among people of a city. We this weekend also had a formerly undocumented woman who is running for school board in Arizona, who described schools as the safe space that she went to as a young person. The only safe space were her words. And so as a school board member, she's going to help to create that for all students in her district, and including undocumented students. So I think that Gara talked about reflective democracy. We have, over the last few years, talked about a more inclusive democracy, one that represents, not just reflects, but also represents the needs of a diverse country. I'm going to pause. I just want to say one more thing before I turn over to Fred. When I started this work, I came out of the immigrant rights movement. I had run a youth organization for South Asians, and then I was Immigrant Affairs Commissioner for New York City. And that was the lens that I brought to the work. But we created a table of other groups working on candidate development. Not one of those groups, and really until last week when Edith Sargon was named Executive Director of Wellstone, not one of the groups working on progressive candidate development was run by a person of color, except for ours. And so when the person making the ask is someone who looks like 80% of Congress and 86% of state legislatures, it doesn't help the cause that we're trying to advance. Because part of what happens when I, as a woman of color, as an immigrant, ask someone to run for office, there is a shortcut, right? And maybe it's not a fair shortcut, but there's a shortcut that happens because I understand at a very gut level what it means to overcome the challenges that we're dealing with every day around people questioning our ability to be at these tables. And then, and this is the last thing I'm going to say for now, is that we don't just want to be at the table, because the problem is that the conversation at the table doesn't reflect our needs. So when I am asked to be at a table, and when I ask others to be at the table, what we're saying is that we also need to change the conversation, because I don't actually want to be a part of the conversations that are already in place. I don't want to be a conversation about here's what we're doing and how do we include immigrants. I want to be a part of the conversation that says this is the America we live in today, and what are the things that we need to be talking about in order to be responsive to that America today.
Thanks, Sayu. Fred?
Great. Thanks, Gara. Thanks, Sayu. It's great to be here with Adriana. Thank you, Common Cause, for another great conference. Thanks particularly to Miles, to Jenny, to Marilyn. I want to get right in and talk a little bit about me, a few words about me and how I got into this. I'm first and foremost an organizer, right? I've been able to help build powerful workers and communities at the local, state, and national levels. I'm a New Yorker from an immigrant family. I got my start, like many folks who got their start in the movement, out of self-interest. I was going to the State University of New York at Binghamton, and then Governor Mario Cuomo decided he was going to raise tuition, which would have made my dream of attaining a college education all the harder. And I didn't know what we could do. And, I was sitting, actually, I'll tell this story quickly. I was sitting in my dorm room and actually complaining to my friend, says, I don't know if this tuition goes up like this governor is talking about. I don't know if I can stay in school. And it just feels like there's nothing we can do. And people don't believe me, but that moment, an organizer came in, knocking on doors from the Student Association and said, hey, look, we're having a meeting, we're planning a strategy, and we're going to beat this tuition hike. And I'll say I was skeptical, to say the least, but I said, what do I have to lose, right? So I went to that meeting and got involved in that campaign. And long story short is we beat that tuition hike, and I understood right away at a very personal level the power of collective action and organizing, and I've been hooked ever since. And I'm also a child of the labor movement, literally. I grew up in Queens, raised by my parents, my mom and dad, and my godparents, my mama and papa. My mom and my papa, they worked nights. They had good union jobs at Lenox Hill Hospital and the post office. They had jobs that allowed them to provide for their families and ultimately for them to retire with economic security, dignity, good pensions. My dad never had a pension, so it's a good thing he's still with my mom for the last, it was 52 years yesterday for them. You know, my mama, my godmother, she had a different experience. My mama was a seamstress. She would make my clothes since I was a baby. She taught me to run a machine when I was just a kid, when I was young. But she, like so many others, worked in a sweatshop. She worked in this airless, windowless building right off Queens Boulevard, where there were rows. I would go pick her up every afternoon. There were rows and rows of sewing machines, worked by mostly a female immigrant workforce. You know, and she did not make the wages or have the benefits that, you know, my mom or my papa had. And in fact, she died in the early 80s of what I now know is a workplace-related illness. So much of who I am and what I do, I think, is connected to my early life experiences. Now, you know, I've been one of the lucky ones, I'd say, that I've been able to have a front row look at important parts of our movement for almost 30 years. You know, I've been part of the student movement fighting for educational access. I organized against apartheid, and in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Central America, I worked on healthcare reform, democracy issues, global justice, and collective bargaining rights and clean energy. I've worked with and for the labor movement, community organizing groups. I've built coalitions, most significantly my years working to build the organization Jobs with Justice. You know, I've seen the most incredible examples of tenacity, courage, risk-taking, hopefulness, truth-telling, hard work, and smarts in so many of the folks I've been lucky enough to work shoulder to shoulder with. But I've also witnessed critical blind spots, particularly around race and gender in our movement, blind spots that I would argue negatively impact our ability to build power and to win. So I welcome this conversation on reflective democracy and just want to drop a couple of 2 or 3 points, I think, into the conversation. First, why it matters. Why does it matter that our movements and our organizations are more inclusive of particularly people of color, but also women and other key parts of our core constituencies? I think for me, it speaks to our values, first and foremost, of what we as a movement believe in, what we think about inclusion and internal democracy. But it also speaks to our effectiveness. Right? I truly believe on so many levels, from elections to organizing and policy issue work, our effectiveness and our ability to build the kind of power we need to build at the state and local level will continue to be connected and reflective of our inclusivity and our power sharing internally within our organizations. You know, now our values and our intentions around these are critical, but I think fundamental to our success is our ability to manifest those intentions, those values in real-world organizational change. So I want to tell a couple quick stories before I was going to say take my seat, before I pass the mic along. Folks may know U.S. Action, the organization I currently work for. We're in the midst of a major merger with 2 other organizing groups, National People's Action, the Alliance for a Just Society, and we're on the verge of completing that. Essentially, we're working as one staff right now today. From the beginning, one of the first statements that we made and we put together as we were forming and having the conversations about forming what will be called People's Action, one of the first documents were our Racial Justice Principles, Program, and Practices. And I just want to read the sort of preamble to that. We're building a new national network that puts racial justice at the core of its work and identity. We believe that economic justice, social justice, and racial justice are interconnected fights that cannot be separated. That is why we believe racial justice is essential to the work of fighting for justice and building people power. Racism is a central and essential part of the government, political, and economic structures in the United States. And to make fundamental change, race and racial justice must be central to every fight. So that started us off, but again, that would not be enough. That'd be nice. It's nice to have that statement. I think I'm proud that we have that statement as part of our memorandum of understanding and putting that together. But again, for us, structurally within the organization that we were building, how did that manifest itself? What did that mean? And again, I don't believe any of this is rocket science. And there are 2 underlying principles as we're figuring out our governing structures. I think first and foremost, we wanted an internal democracy where, our affiliates, those folks building organizations at the state and local level, that they really ran the organization. And so from the beginning, we said in our structure for the organization that, of the representatives of the board of directors, 2/3 of them are going to be from our affiliates. Fundamentally have real control of the direction of the organization. And again, going further, not just 2/3, but of those 2/3, at least half of them need to be local leaders. Leaders who have power in their organizations, not necessarily full-time staff. Yeah, we can have some full-time staff, but again, lifting up leaders within the organization. And then overall, as we look at the entire board, we said, we're striving and we're setting as a standard to have the board be made up of 50% women, 50% people of color. And I'll be happy to say that as we've put together the initial board through the MOU process, we've attained all those standards. Again, this is not, to me, rocket science. This is things that we manifest our intentions and we just make happen and do. Yet are critically important, our structures are critically important reflections of our values. I'll tell one other quick story, and this is an electoral story. This is the state's Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, where in the primary, Citizen Action Wisconsin, one of our affiliates, made the court decision to endorse Judge Joe Donald over Judge Joanne Kloppenburg. And that was controversial amongst the progressive community. Many people felt that Joanne Kloppenburg was a strong progressive, and she is, and felt that she should have gotten that endorsement and had the endorsement of many other organizations, allied organizations in that race. We made Citizen Action Wisconsin made the endorsement of Joe Donald, and there was a blog post that Robert Craig, our director there, said, and he said, if you look at one of the most critical watershed issues facing Wisconsin, a state that has the highest levels of incarceration for Native American men and African American men, that this has to rise to a special place. And so the fact that, endorsing Joe Donald as the best person to be able to deal with the mass incarceration issue in Wisconsin is the reason we're doing that. And, we lost some donors in Wisconsin. We lost some friends, and there was a lot of internal controversy. But again, I think folks on that board, in that leadership said, again, how do we manifest our values in this? And that was another opportunity to do that. And again, not rocket science, but some of this, I think, as Sayu started to say, it presents challenges. And it challenges, our organizations internally. It challenges the way many of us have been doing things. But again, if we don't continue, I go back to what I was saying earlier, continue to change and change the way we do things, I think it blocks us from winning and building the kind of power necessary. Last couple of things I'll just say is sort of, how do we create leadership training opportunities, particularly for people of color within our organizations? I think that is a critical conversation, because ultimately, I've been in conversations where you get to the leadership conversation or top staff leadership, and people say, well, we can't find any people of color. And partially, I think the organizations that have done the best have done a good job of creating leadership ladders internally within their organizations. And then secondly, what are our pipelines? Where are folks, where are we finding folks, whether it's to run for election, whether it's to take staff jobs within organizations, whether it's to be leaders in our organization, what are the pipelines for those folks? I come from from the old days, I'm a past president of the U.S. Student Association. There's just so many of us, and I would say so many people of color who have important places in the movement, people like Greg Moore, Eddie Morales, Sarita Gupta, who came out of that organization. And I think that's not the only one, but we should identify and support other pipelines for folks. So let me stop there and pass it on to Adriana, but thank you very much, folks. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. Hello, everyone. My name is Adriana Alvarez. I am a McDonald's worker from Chicago. I am a single mom I have a 4-year-old little boy. where do I start? Let's see. When I first started at McDonald's, you know, you follow the rules. You think those are the rules. You got to follow them. Okay, whatever. So I want to say 2 years ago, my organizer from the 5 for 15, he came up to me in the parking lot and said, "Hey, have you heard about the 5 for 15?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I saw it on TV a couple of times." He's like, "So what do you think?" I'm like, "Well, that's crazy. You know, we're not going to get 15. He's like, "Well, yeah, but it's a start, right?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, you know, like 10, 12, that's more reasonable." He's like, "Yeah, see, it's a start." So he ended up coming to my house later that day, and we started talking about, he's like, "So tell me what happens at work." And I would tell him, "Oh, you know, we have to punch out and then count our box. So we have a register, we have to count our box. And we would be off the clock." He's like, "You know that's illegal, right?" And I looked at him like, "Wait, are you serious? This is illegal?" And we're not, he's like, "Yeah, you should be getting paid for that." And like I started to bubble because it had been 2 years that we had gotten a raise. And after 2 years, McDonald's decided to give us 10-cent raises. So it's like, wait, 5 cents a year? Are you kidding? Like I do all this work, you make billions of money in profit off of my hard work, and I get 10 cents. So people were already really frustrated at my job. I was frustrated after learning that that stuff was illegal. So I went back to work and I told them, like, "Hey, this is illegal, you know, this is going on, it's illegal, don't, you know, come to my house. There's gonna be a meeting at my house." We started small meetings at a friend's house, and then once more people got involved in my store, they came to my house because I was the one that actually told them everything. And we started this petition where we wanted respect because managers were yelling at us like we were nothing, like in front of the customer. So that gave the customer, they felt like they had a right to yell at you, and you were wrong because you were getting yelled at in front of everybody. And to me, it was really disrespectful. So we came together, we made this petition. The McDonald's that I work at is a franchise, which means it's privately owned. He has 6 stores. We managed to organize 3. Out of those 3 stores, my store had 29 signatures, and I got a total of 51 signatures. So my store was the most organized. We came together, we gave it to our store manager, my store, and they didn't want to take it. They're like, no, I'm not going to take it. We left it on the counter. Next thing you know, so in December, we got that 10-cent raise after 2 years. In March, 2 weeks after we turned in that petition, we get another raise. They stopped making us punch out to count our boxes. They let us punch in ourselves because they would punch us in whenever they felt like we could be punched in. So those were like small victories at my store that I realized that the 5 for 15 was going somewhere and that we can get somewhere. And so that was in March. 3 months after, in June, we get another surprise raise. So all this other talk about them saying, there's no money, when we would ask, what about our raise, what about our raise? There's no money. Where did this money come from? And these raises were bigger. They were from 25 cents to 75 cents. So in 3 months. So we, definitely a huge victory. And that's one way that I got a whole bunch of people to come on the 5 for 15, like, hey, look, this happened 2 years ago, we weren't getting any raises, and now look, 6 months later, you're lucky you're getting paid this, I was getting paid this, and I've had to work for that. And so people they're like, oh, well, yeah. And what people don't want to do is like come to meetings and all that other stuff, but I mean, I don't have anything else to do besides my son, so I'm here, and I enjoy being a part of this. I see that we are winning across, not just at my store, like across the nation. Seattle has 15, New York just got 15, California. There's so many wins, and it's not just in the US. This is a global movement. I've been around, not around the world, but I've been to several places. Brazil, I've been to Argentina, and they have unions. And it's like, they're looking at me like, wait, you're from the United States. I'm like, yeah, I know. So I just hang my head, I'm like, I know. They're like, how do you not have this? How do you not have, they have bonuses at McDonald's. I'm like, what's a bonus? They're looking at me like I'm crazy or like I'm lying. I'm like, I'm not lying. I don't have sick days. I don't have paid, I don't have anything. None of those rights, and I'm sitting there coughing on your food. People don't understand that. They hear 15 and they're like, oh, no. Well, you don't understand that, okay, we need rights too. We're human. It's not just because, oh, it's a high school job. It's not a high school job anymore. There are families who depend on this job, mine being one of them, but there are several cases, and I'm just really glad that I joined the fight. And when they asked me to join the National Organizing Committee, which is like a bunch of leaders from every from every city coming together once in a while to talk about, what's next, how we're doing, how to get people to join. It's just a great feeling to come together with people who have the same mindset as you, who are driven to get, what we deserve, honestly, because we work hard and these people they're sitting on their billions of dollars, literally sitting on them, and they don't want to talk to us. We've been to the shareholder meetings. We've tried to come and talk to them, like, hey, you know what? We just want to talk. How did they greet us? With rifles. They had men on the top of the building because they thought we were going to be violent. We don't want violence. We just want to sit and talk and for you to listen and realize that you do have the money to pay. You don't have to raise anything. Your price, the prices of the Big Macs, because when I went to Europe, in Iceland, I think it was, no, Greenland, one of those, I'm sorry. They have unions, they get paid well, they have benefits, they have sick days, they have all this other stuff. And again, they were looking at us like we're crazy. Some girl came up to us and said, what you get paid in 2 weeks, I make in 3 days. I looked at her and I was ready to run out that room because I was so mad. Like, I'm ready to quit and just move to where she lives because we're doing the same work for the same company. How is it possible that what I make in 2 weeks, you make in 3 days? It was just amazing to me, and I know it's possible because it's been done over there. It's been happening. So why can't it happen here? Why not? Stop being greedy and give us what we deserve. We just want to move ahead. It's not like, we're stuck in a place and we can't go anywhere because of these poverty wages, and we're tired of it. And when we come together, you can feel that energy that we're tired, and it's just great. And I'm glad to be a part of this 5 for 15, and I can't wait to see what's next.
Thank you, Adriana and Fred and Sayu. As we head into the final 20 minutes or so of this session, and before shortly going out to the room, because it's my experience at gatherings like this that there's a lot of rich experience and perspective in the room, and we want to widen the conversation as soon as we can. Let me just say a few things about what I've heard and ask 1 or 2 questions growing out of that I want to ask the panelists, if they choose to expand on or to reflect on. So listening to Sayu, I was struck by the way, both in her personal example and also in some of the other stories she told, about the way immigrants and leaders of color are drawn into politics by their lives and their personal experiences and the desire to use politics to make a change. I was struck by her kind of riff on the reflective democracy thing by saying we don't just want democracy to be reflective, but representative. And that whether that's a semantic difference or a more principled difference, it's a very important point. And then, this issue which threads throughout a lot of these conversations about being at the table versus changing the conversation. I'm familiar with the merger, very exciting merger that Fred is talking about because, having had a vantage point on social movements and organizing networks for 20 years or so, it's all too rare that people come together, to unite behind it and try to be more effective together. Fred began to talk a little bit about something that is rarely talked about really among us, and that is the question of democracy within organizations. We talk about democracy as if it was about government, which it is, but in our movements, how many of our organizations are truly representative and reflective and accountable to people? So, in the landscapes in which I've always operated as a funder, most of the organizations that we support, many fine organizations, have no real base, except their funders. And that's fine, and many of them are quite effective, but there are organizations of which U.S. Action and its counterparts are one, of which Common Cause actually is one, which have some kind of base to which they're accountable. And I'd love to kind of go a little bit deeper into that aspect of it. And then I would love to hear more, at some point about the Wisconsin endorsement situation and the how that came to be and what the issues were. And I took note of, and I think it's a very important point, that we need, and this gets to some of Sayu's work, pipelines of leadership for people. And indeed it gets to Adriana's work and the global work that she's been able to do. If there is not a pipeline and a system for people to move up into leadership, for somebody like Adriana from Cicero, to be going to Iceland and Brazil and standing in solidarity with workers around the world. In USSA, for instance, United States Student Association, for instance, has been a really good vehicle for doing that over the years. And, what are the others? And then, I'm struck in listening to Adriana by the power, if you will, of narrative and larger solidarity to knit together. Now, it helps that McDonald's is a global corporation, for better or for worse, so that you have counterparts around the world, and it's all over the place. It's ubiquitous. And therefore, this fight, and I think the Fight for 15, which is a term even, David Rolfe, who's been active in this, through SCIU in Washington, is about to come out with a book in the next month or two about the story of the Fight for 15, which all of you ought to read, those of you who are less familiar with the story. But, Fight for 15 is a narrative, is a label, is a movement, is a vehicle to knit together what otherwise might be the disparate struggles of people in different places. So, how can we find more organizing concepts that enable somebody in Cicero and somebody in Reykjavik, to be kind of standing in the same fight, really. So those are some of the themes that emerged for me. So before we go out into the crowd, the one thing I want to talk about a little bit more, I invite people to talk about a little bit more, and starting with Sayu, because she made this point, and I want to give her a chance to reflect on it, is so what is the difference between being at the table and changing the conversation? Because there's a premise that the more the table looks like the country, the more the conversation changes. But I'm getting a sense from what you say, which is of course true, that that's not automatic. And so what is that? How do you go from that gap to presence to representation and changing the conversation? Can you talk about a little bit more about that?
Well, so if you, it was a more crowded field. It still is crowded, but if you look at the Republican candidates, for example, there's a kind of diversity, right? Well, actually, if you look at both sides, there was an article a couple months ago about how more of the presidential candidates have an immigrant connection than in any other class of presidential candidate. But we know that the conversation that they're having is not the conversation that we want to have, right? So just not to be overly simplistic, but that's it. So I think that until people feel that they are empowered to change the conversation that's happening rather than just add on to whatever what the menu is, the menu that is being offered, we're going to still have that. So there's a, Rashad Robinson talks about presence and power. Right. So, so I think that's sort of, the two quick things that I would say to that, because how do we get there, I think, is a very long journey. I think we need more people, for example. Often when you're the only, it's very difficult to make the case for a policy or a reform. When there's more of you that are likely to vote for, articulate, advocate, there's a greater chance that it's going to happen. And then one other thing I want to say, just related to this issue of representation, that to be clear, we are not talking, certainly not in our organization and in the broader conversation, but we're not talking just about Latinos representing Latino constituencies and Asian Americans representing Asian Americans. We're talking about having a more diverse leadership for the entire country. First of all, there are very few places that someone can get elected purely on the basis of ethnicity alone. So if another way of answering your question, Gara, is if we think, less about identity politics and more about a conversation that is really inclusive, that's about equity rather than diversity.
Yeah, you think that the lack of attention to communities of color issue in the Republican field is that if only Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Ben Carson just had more company, they'd feel safer, kind of coming out.
No, what I'm saying is that just because you're Latino,
Right.
and just because you're Asian American,
Right.
does not mean that you're going to be an advocate.
Right.
And in their case, well, this is a nonpartisan. I run a nonpartisan organization. But the other thing, and maybe this ties a little bit to what Adriana was raising too, in terms of people not liking meetings. One thing that we have found, it's a whole other area that I didn't address in too much detail, but it is expensive to be a good citizen, right? So when people talk to me about not having enough diversity and not being able to find leaders, I think one of the challenges, and we experience this all the time in recruiting folks to run, that you do have to have a certain amount of financial stability to be on the boards of nonprofits, to forget about the cost of campaigns for a moment. But in order to have name recognition, even in a small town, it means you have to be showing up. So in order to show up, you have to have some flexibility. If you're a parent of young children, if you're a young parent of children, all these things that factor into, can I spend this extra evening at a meeting? Can I go to a gala event, or can I go to the PTA association? Places where you are seen and where it's important to be seen, it costs you in time and resources to be able to do that. And so that affects who is at the table and how they're showing up.
Yeah, and it's expensive to be poor. I mean, if you look at the new book on eviction and saw the article in the Times last weekend about that, I mean, there's an industry based on exploiting poor people, and we're coming to see that more and more as the result of profiteering. Adriana, do you want to say a little? I mean, if I don't mind my asking, so do you have, to Sayu's point, what kind of support system do you have that enables you to be able to make the time to do this?
Well, actually, my son is actually with me at most of the meetings. They come with me. Yeah, he goes to rallies with me as well. If it's not too cold, if it's not too early, he loves holding up signs, and he will get mad if I take it from him.
How old is he?
He's gonna be 4. Yeah. So he likes going to rallies. If it's too early or if it's too cold, his aunts actually can take care of him, and they help me out a lot. My mom started working, so she can't really help me, but it was either her or his aunts, and that's my main support right now, which I'm really glad for, or else I wouldn't be here.
And finally, before I guess the way it works here, is that if people have comments, questions, they should go and stand at one of the mics, and then in a minute we'll get out to you. So please feel free to get up and do that now. But Fred, just on the point about kind of the internal democracy of organizations, I'd love to expand on that a little bit. And it is messy, right? I mean, it's always more time consuming, and when you're the leader, more frustrating sometimes. I mean, I actually run a democracy of rich people, so I know that. I know that. I mean, even as plutocratic as the Democracy Alliance is, they vote for the board, and I'm accountable to elections and all that. So I have and I started my career in the ACLU, which was is Carrie Moss still here? It was a ridiculously democratic organization. But, it's not the norm anymore. So talk a little bit about that. It's more time consuming, but it results in a stronger...
Yeah, I mean, I think it is more time consuming. It's hard, it's messy, it's not clean and neat. There's not like one or two people that can make all the decisions and things happen, but I think it is actually, at the end of the day, fosters more ownership at multiple levels of the organization and creates more opportunity for leadership at multiple levels for the organization, and allows you to do things like, for example, even, Andrea, hearing what you said, one of the other principles we've said, because we want so many leaders on the board, well, we're going to have childcare at every meeting. Right? So, again, not...
So what do you have to do structurally?
Right. Not rocket science, right? But it's things that are simple that you can do to really allow for people's full participation, which is a shift. Right? In the old days, I remember starting as an organizer, folks would say, look, if you're not willing to work 80 hours a week, if you're not willing to give up every personal relationship you have, all your family, and all that, you really can't cut it as an organizer. And, well, sign me up, that's great. But again, that can't be, we can't set up the bar. Here's what it is to be in this organization. If you can't meet that, you can't be there. I think especially if we want to be bigger, broader, more powerful. And I think partly the internal democracy piece is part of, we can't say to folks who are working hard every day, building organizations at the ground that, yeah, well, guess what, you're just consumers of our campaigns. You're not creators of them.
Right.
And I think that we have to all be, have a part in the creation of things, to feel ownership and engagement.
So I was going to open it up, to the group at this time. We have, 7 minutes or something like that before whatever the next break is. So I'd encourage people to come up to the mic. I know it requires, standing up. There's childcare available for anybody who wants to do that. No? Going once? Going twice? Come on. Okay.
Hi, I'm Katie. Thank you so much to all of you for speaking today. I was just hoping to hear another example or two of you doing this work to be more reflective within your organizations. You talked about it, I think specifically you've read about how it's not rocket science. Could you give us an example of, those simple things that actually aren't that simple and talk about the challenge and how you overcome it?
Sure, let me do a quick example. This is an example from Jobs and Justice, right? Folks know that organization. Worked there for 15 years, started as the first executive director. The truth of the matter is the leadership body of that organization was entirely made up of union presidents. And as we built out the infrastructure of local coalitions around the country, rightly so, a bunch of those coalitions said, hey, wait, what's our role? We think it is great, we're part of this network, but what's our role in actual deciding what the national campaigns or national decisions are? And it's like, well, that's a really good point. And so, again, pretty simple, but took a lot of work to change a culture where it was a number of union presidents who had final sway to shift actually the governing body to a tripartite body of, union leadership, local coalition leaders and staff, and allied organizations. And again, not rocket science, but it took a process and a level of conversation to get that. And the trade-off, and I will say this, the trade-off for that for the local coalitions that were part of Jobs and Justice, the trade-off was, okay, the trade-off of you getting more say at the national level, of being on the board and making decisions nationally, is we're now going to we want you part of creating national standards of what it means to be an affiliate of this organization. Because when we started, it was anybody with two sides could say they were Jobs of Justice, and that was great. But that trade-off was actually a pretty good trade-off, and people actually thought about that and worked on that and made that happen. But again, I would say not rocket science, but took work to make happen.
Anybody onto that question and more examples?
I just very quickly would say that, we bring our alumni onto a national advisory committee and eventually onto the board, that we have to be very intentional about, because we are a pan-ethnic organization, our board represents all the different communities that we are working with. So those are just small ways in which we're very intentional about the leadership of the organization.
Anyone add to that? No? Well, let me just say a word. I don't know if the question was posed to me as well, but on the Democracy Alliance as an institution, because you have to try to walk the walk. We have moved in the reflectiveness sense toward a considerably more reflective portfolio of groups. I think it may now be the majority of groups in the portfolio that are led by leaders of color. Our staff has gone to something like 70% people of color in the last 2 years, who's at the conferences and speaking and exposed to the donors and part of the conversation anyway has become significantly more diverse, at least 50% speakers of color in the last couple of years. So we worked very hard at that. With respect to the Democracy Alliance itself, as I say, half kiddingly, as a democracy itself, tried to increase the democracy in the Democracy Alliance, and we have a couple of partners here. The strategic focus that we now have was a result of a year-long process of consultation, not only among the partners, but among other stakeholders, and there were something like 7 kind of town hall kinds of meetings around the country where people got to weigh in and have some influence, and and I think there's a substantial alignment behind the outcome of that. But even where people disagree in parts, at least there was a process in which they were heard, which is not rocket science, but hasn't always been applied in organizations. And then when I think about the earlier parts of my professional life in foundations that are almost by definition unaccountable to anybody, the way the tax laws work and so on, and are hardly democratic institutions, at the Open Society Foundation, to some extent Atlantic, we tried, to add the voices of boards and advisory committees, people who are most affected, who came from the communities that we were funding. Not perfect, not democratic, but at least some effort to be more reflective and accountable. So in terms of the desire to have people talk about it more practically, I thought I would just toss in my own experiences as well.
This question's for Adriana. I was just curious if you could speak a little bit to working with the media and having them cover your story, or how you coordinated that, if they did, if you felt like it took a long time. Yeah, just general thoughts.
Well, with the Fight for 15, we have organizers that deal with communications and stuff. So what they did was they were like, hey, do you want to be a part of not like a reality show, but it was just like a video of what I do in a day with my son, and that's actually online. I have, I think, 5 videos up. It shows a regular day, me and my son, me getting out of work, picking him up, and then a couple protests, a couple strikes, and then twice when I got arrested at the shareholders meeting, and once in front of my store, we blocked off Cicero. So time-wise, yes, it was really consuming. They came to my house a couple of days out of the week for a few hours. But after that, they taught me how to use Twitter, so I'm on Twitter now. And I guess that's how it all started circling around, and that's how I became what I am now. Thank you.
We'll take one more question, I guess, because we're almost at time.
It's a little bit of a statement as well as a question.
Okay.
And it comes from a whole other different area, but I always believe in something called CASE, copy and steal everything. Whatever works elsewhere, steal it. There's a group called the National Breast Cancer Coalition Conference, and they do something that's incredible. They raise a lot of money, and they have what's called Project Lead. And Project Lead is where they take women who are interested in getting active, and they educate them. They have to go, it's free. They educate them as to the science of what's going on. And then, when they get on boards, they're not just sitting there. They're very educated, and their voice can make a difference. So I recommend that as you go forward, that you do that you have a grassroots educating the people who you then get out there, because there is a reticence in getting out there and speaking if you're not up on the issues.
Thank you. Well, it's 11:46, and I think that we're the only thing standing between you and lunch and exciting self-organized working sessions. So as Miles gets up, I just want to ask if any of my colleagues have any final reflections they want to share.
I hope you guys will run for office.
Don't exempt yourself from that. We're waiting for you to take leadership, and I expect to be on your campaign committee for mayor of New York in
I'm running
2021.
for 1,000 offices.
Well, thank you all for listening so engagedly, and to my colleagues up here in the panel. It's been a privilege to be able to share this conversation with you today.
All right, and thanks very much. That was great. That was really, really good.